Good evening, everyone. We'll start in just a few seconds. Good to see everyone.
Oh, here's Beth.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Elvis Mendez. I'm the Executive Director of Neighbor Massachusetts, and it's great to see everyone. I have the pleasure of moderating this really exciting panel tonight. We're all here to unpack and grapple with some of the great lessons that were learned from the book Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections, which is available through orbooks.com. Before we get started and hear from our panelists and respondents, we just wanted to share a quick word on process for tonight. We're going to hear from three of our distinguished panelists. Each is going to present on their writings and own experiences, which are related to the book. And then we're going to hear from our three respondents who are going to help us situate the lessons learned and other insights within the context of Massachusetts, and also provide other thoughts and questions for us to chew on. Questions we're going to take towards the end of the presentation, but if you have questions that come up through the process of something that sparks your interest from the different panelists, please include them in the chat, and I'll do my best to sort them by theme. And then we're going to call on respondents after the panelists and the respondents have finished. So we're all aware, I think what brings us here is the reality of the interlocking crises that we're facing as a country. Gridlock in Washington, the rightward shift of the highest courts, which daily delivers some devastating news, terrible, life-altering, cataclysmic event it feels like, and of course the corporate domination that rules over our federal races, and which is, I think, moving many of us to recognize the importance of our states as a terrain of struggle. And here in Massachusetts, we have a particular set of challenges which we all face. A regionalism, which considers much of the state outside of Greater Boston, really anything west of Natick, and certainly anything that's as south as New Bedford, as sort of a political afterthought in our process. We've got a state house and a legislative process that is incredibly opaque, and a set of challenges when it comes to raising money for local candidates, for movement candidates, despite having some of the best fundraising infrastructure in the state, powerful and influential donor class, but small and big donors, which are oftentimes conditioned to see the races outside of Massachusetts as more pivotal and important to invest in. And underlying, I think, all of this is the dominance of the neoliberal Democrats, which is a different terrain of struggle than faced by a lot of our comrades and allies in other parts of the state, where extreme right wing is the clear opposition and enemy. And the further, I think, damage that's done is this perpetuation of the myth of Massachusetts exceptionalism. Just a book a few months ago came out on that topic, Massachusetts being an exceptional state in the country, which I think oftentimes causes us to confuse sort of being adjacent to power with having power. And with confusing party affiliation with actual governing authority. So we're really excited to get the chance to hear from folks who have been really at the forefront across the country, grappling with these issues, leading struggles, leading campaigns to win multiracial coalitions, build the movement infrastructure and the independent political power, which we'd like to have here in Massachusetts. So without further ado, I wanted to quickly introduce our panelists and the respondents for tonight. Starting off with Linda Burnham. Linda is a nationally recognized movement leader, known for her work in the Third World Women's Alliance in the 1970s. She co-founded with Miriam Jing-Louis, the Women of Color Resource Center, serving as the organization's executive director for 18 years. I had the pleasure of knowing Linda when she served as a national senior advisor and research director for the Domestic Workers Alliance. It's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight. Rafael Navar is our second panelist. He's a co-founder of Mi Gente and the former national political director for the Communications Worker of America. And among other things, he served as the California State Director for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. Great to have you, Rafael. And lastly, Jacob Swenson Lengel is on the editorial board of Convergence. He served as the Director of Communications and Narrative at Pennsylvania Stands Up, as well as the Deputy Director of Communications at People's Actions. Thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us. And to our three respondents, distinguished respondents, Vanessa Snow, who is the Policy and Organizing Director at Mass Vote, Rand Wilson, who is a longtime labor organizer, most recently with Teamsters for Democratic Union, and Beth Huang, the Executive Director of the Mass Voter Table. We wanted to also thank Mass Progressive Action Committee, Mass Peace Action, and Liberation Road, among others, for helping make tonight possible. And so I will turn it over to Linda to start us off. Again, questions can be placed in the chat. We're going to give presenters each time to present on their writing and experience before turning it over to our respondents and then opening it up for a Q&A. So, Linda?
Thank you so much, Elvis. And thank you to both Cole and Mass Peace Action and Elvis and Neighbor to Neighbor and others who've convened us this evening. Really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with progressive activists in Massachusetts and to figure out what we can share and what we can learn from each other. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how this book came into being and what we were trying to do. Why this book? I'm going to start with the title, Power Concedes Nothing. Most of you probably on this Zoom know that that is a quote from Frederick Douglass. Some may not. It's always good to tap into Douglass's wisdom and ferocity about liberation. So I just want to read you a little bit of that quote. It is, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And there's another part of this, which is, many of you will also know this quote, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. This is from the same speech. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are those who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Douglass wrote this speech in 1857. It was given in Western New York, and it was given in commemoration of the abolition of slavery by Britain in 1834. So Britain abolished the slave trade and slavery in its colonies, in the West Indies in particular, in 1834. And the US, was lagging. So Douglass gave this speech, and in it, he specifically spoke to the need for many different avenues and approaches to the liberation of the enslaved peoples of the Americas. So there's a lot to learn from this speech. So the first thing I'd say is read it. Why this book? This book was conceived right after the election, right after the November 2020 election. First memo, I went back to my emails, and the first memo about it is on January 7th, the day after the insurrection, at which point we didn't really fully understand what the insurrection represented. But we decided that we were going to do like a hard drive to figure out how to get this done so that it would be out in time for people to engage with it. We knew, and I'm talking about myself and my co-editors. My co-editors are Max Elbaum, who is one of the founders or something related to Convergence, and Maria Poblet, who's the director at Grassroots Power Project, all of us knew that an amazing amount of work had been done in relationship to the 2020 elections. And we also knew that in part that work represented a really important turn of folks on the progressive to left end of the spectrum, of large numbers of people on the progressive to left end of the spectrum, to really engaging seriously with electoral politics and to trying to figure out how their ongoing grassroots, place-based and issue-based and constituency-based organizing related to the electoral arena. And many folks who had, for one reason or another, and the reasons were many, essentially sat out elections, and who even maybe didn't engage in the election in 2016, learned from that they had to figure out how to engage in 2020. And folks know from the Elizabeth Warren campaign and from the Bernie Sanders campaign that the possibilities for progressive politics to show up in the electoral arena were opening from many different avenues. So what we wanted to do in putting this book together is we wanted to, first of all, really encourage people who were engaged in the work to do the kind of analysis and evaluation and documentation that oftentimes is not done, and is not done to our detriment. We felt like we knew that there were enormous amount of lessons learned, and we knew that we might lose those lessons if we didn't lean on people who are really, really, really busy to stop and do some reflection and do some writing. So I have to say here also, great praise and thanks to the organizers who took time out of their extraordinarily busy schedules, and it's not easy to sit and write, to reflect and write, to have the kinds of conversations that pull the lessons and then put them down on paper. So all praise is due to those who did that. But we wanted those lessons to be shared. We wanted those who had helped to contribute to the defeat of Trump in 2020 to have their say, and not to leave it to historians who were not doing the work to come back around and try and figure out what the heck had happened. We knew that some of this work is oftentimes obscure, all the door knocking, it's not, there's not a lot of glamour necessarily in pulling people together and figuring out their scripts and, giving them their turf and then sending them out to door knock and then doing all the calculations about who hit what marks. That's not particularly glamorous work, but it's absolutely necessary work. And we felt like it was important to make it visible. We also wanted to create the possibility of sharing lessons across states and networks. We wanted the people in Pennsylvania to know what the people in Arizona had done and vice versa. We wanted the people in Florida to be able to share their lessons with North Carolina. We also wanted to figure out how those lessons from 2022 and from 2020 might also be relevant for 2022 and 2024. And then I think the two other things that we were trying to do is we still feel like it's really important to kind of give intentionality and coherence to a trend in progressive politics that is actually deepening its practice in this realm of bringing social justice values, social justice work, and constituencies into the electoral arena, and start to give some intentionality and coherence to that trend in politics nationally. And then finally, we also wanted to really inspire other folks to do this work, which we feel like is extraordinarily important. It's not the only work, obviously, but it is an important strand of work. And then I'll just say a little bit about key lessons, and then I'll probably be about done. So among the lessons, and I know my co-panelists will expand on this and give it some specificity. Door knocking is indispensable. Who knew? So lots of our folks really spoke to the importance of something that's called deep canvassing, really engaging with people, seriously, the kind of eyeball to eyeball work. It's also, there are other forms of this work that are important. So texting and phone calling and TV messages and all of the rest of it. But that eyeball to eyeball work in terms of both training those who are doing it and deepening their understanding of their roles, not just as door knockers, but as organizers and messengers, and also getting a feel of those on whose doors we are knocking. So that's critical, and also was difficult in the context of COVID. Culturally informed organizing is critical. So, see the chapter about Georgia, for example, where Adelina Nichols talks about the extraordinarily important work of Georgia Latinas. I can't remember completely what GLAR stands for, but they did incredible work in Latino communities across Georgia, as did Nse Ufat and Cliff Albright. And so really thinking about, do I need a mariachi band, or do I need fried chicken and potato salad? Or what is it that I need to be able to bring people out and engage them in ongoing conversation? Another lesson, that meshing ongoing political work for folks who are doing ongoing organizing. This was true in one of the chapters I worked on, which is about domestic worker organizing, that figuring out how to mesh ongoing organizing and electoral work is necessary and it's possible, but it is not easy. It demands a whole bunch of resources. The ways in which that work is organized are different. Figuring out how to work at scale and with a time deadline and to meet particular metrics is not necessarily the way all ongoing organizing takes place. So it's possible to mesh those things, but it is not easy. Also, really important, that losses contain as many lessons as the wins. Read the chapter on Florida, please, by Andrea Mercado. So there are, places in which we may not do quite what it is we want to do, but there are deep lessons in those losses. Just a couple more things. I see my time is going. There's a frame around low propensity voters that's out there. There's also whole sets of voters that the Democratic Party has either ignored or taken for granted, or both. And many of the folks in this book talk about reframing low propensity voters as high potential voters, or reframing them as low investment voters, for whom, if the investment is made, they may, in fact, turn out. And so with the goal of expanding the electorate, really engaging with those voters who have been dismissed, or whom the Democratic Party has decided that they want to spend all their time on suburban moms, or whomever, whatever the strategy is, really expanding the electorate through encouraging low propensity voters to turn into high potential voters. Also from the Georgia chapter, white working class voters need to see white working class people on their doors. Surprise, surprise. I think my time is gone, but I just want to say that the potential for change in the South came up over and over and over again, from not just Georgia, but from also North Carolina. The restoring voting rights campaigns to restore voting rights to the formerly incarcerated was one of the most impactful tactics. So I think I'm going to stop there. And I just want to really encourage folks to learn the lessons that we learned in engaging the writers of this book. I really want to encourage you to read it, to dip into it and then dip into it again and then dip into it again. There are a lot of lessons there. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Linda. Fantastic framing way to start us off. I'm going to turn it over to Jacob.
Thank you, and thanks, Linda. I'll echo your thanks. It's wonderful to be with you all in Massachusetts and to be alongside wonderful panelists. And I was thrilled to be in the book with so many superstar organizers and so many doing work in so many different places and parts of the movement. So, and I should also say, like what you're saying, Linda, like this book was, or this invite to write a chapter was actually the perfect opportunity to do something that may not have happened if we weren't asked to write it. So my co-author Jules and I ended up having several conversations, kind of focus groups with volunteers and members across the local chapters of Pennsylvania Stands Up that sort of served as the basis of what I'm going to present to you tonight. So I think the book really was, it was an opportunity for us to do deeper, evaluation and learning from the work that we did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about PA Stands Up and who we are and how we came to be. I'll talk a little bit about what we did in 2020 and then a little bit about what we learned. Some of what you were saying, Elvis, about Massachusetts, I think can describe the situation in Pennsylvania. There's pretty different geographic regions of the state, and folks' identities tend to be pretty linked to their county. And outside of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, there's been very little investment, both from the Democratic Party. I mean, the party is very atrophied, not sending mailers, all sorts of things in a lot of the 67 counties that are in Pennsylvania. But also progressive groups just really are absent from so many small towns and rural communities historically. But that has begun to change, especially since the 2016 election. And that is really the origin story of Pennsylvania Stands Up. Pennsylvania Stands Up officially formed at the beginning of 2020, right at the start, out of 9 local groups that had been doing organizing since 2016. And there's kind of 3 different strands of DNA that came to make up our 9 chapters. There were a series of resistance groups that formed after Trump was elected. Lancaster Stands Up in Lancaster. There was a network of really small groups that called themselves Pennsylvania Together. And then there were a number of indivisible chapters. And then also, there was a bunch of energy coming out of the Bernie campaign that led to the formation of our Philadelphia chapter, Reclaim Philadelphia. And the other experience that led to the creation of PA Stands Up was 2 2018 congressional campaigns for Jess King in Lancaster and Reverend Dr. Greg Edwards in the Lehigh Valley. And their campaign vehicles, kind of like Bernie helped create, helped grow DSA, those 2 campaigns helped really energize and create local organizations from the volunteers that were a part of them. But over the 4 years between 2016 and 2020, these groups just really realized that to build statewide power, they had to break out of the county level organizing that they're doing and the lobbying and start collaborating across urban-rural divides, across race, with the goal of really building a multiracial working class coalition that would be capable of moving things at the state level, not just in their local areas. And so in 2020, we came together immediately before the pandemic for our founding convention. And the next week, COVID hit. And just like rereading my chapter, it's like 2020 was so many things happening at once. And it was an unprecedented wave of movement moments. And so, our organization, there have been a history, especially in Lancaster Stands Up, of kind of momentum-based organizing and thinking about how do we use these upsurges to build our organization. And so that's something we really tried to do throughout 2020. When the pandemic hit, there were a lot of mutual aid efforts that started. One of the local candidates who helped create Reclaim Philadelphia was running for the state house. He turned his campaign into kind of like a hybrid campaign / mutual aid effort as a way of like both connecting with constituents, but also bringing in volunteers and people to the organization who are kind of newly activated by the pandemic moment. And similarly, over the summer, when George Floyd was murdered, there was just a huge groundswell in Pennsylvania with, towns like Manheim, which is a township of like 5,000 people, 95% white, and young Black folks like coming out leading marches for the like the first time in recorded memory in this little tiny town. Like there was a social justice, racial justice march. And so we really focused on supporting those uprisings and then trying to draw people into our chapters and into our electoral programs. And that was a really successful effort in a lot of ways, especially in the Lehigh Valley. A number of the people who came in through the street protests ended up getting plugged into the electoral work going into the fall. And so like Morgan Tucker was one of those folks. She was a white gal who got involved in the uprisings and wanted to play a role in defeating Donald Trump and combating white supremacy. And she ended up being a deep canvas captain. And she did so many shifts just reaching to voters. And so I think that was the interplay there between social movements and how do you absorb that energy and take those folks and say, yes, it's street heat. It's also getting people to the ballot box. And then we're going to go do street heat again after the election, which we did. There were some tensions and challenges there, like, just in terms of capacity, organizing marches and rallies at the same time as you're trying to do GOTV forces like you really have to weigh what are you investing in? How do you strategically decide what to do? And then as we were approaching the final, the final days, we were very torn in the last month about how much effort to spend in protecting the results versus doing persuasion and GOTV. And so we basically split our organizing staff in two, and a lot of our staff and volunteers were focused on election defense at the same time as we were doing GOTV, which was that's like, we knew there was going to be this movement moment following the election. But it was difficult to think strategically about that. And I think we started late, which is something that I think as we think about 2024 is going to be, really, really important. So let's see here. I think some of the things that we learned through our effort, I think one is we really tried to use narrative strategy as a tool to kind of bridge some of the tensions that there were between the issues and the movement moments and the electoral work. So we had a number of down ballot candidates that we endorsed who were very deeply aligned with us on values, but Biden was not helping during the election as we were seeing this huge groundswell around racial justice. And we felt very tense with the public statements that he was making, with the way in which he was reinforcing dominant narratives around public safety. And so we really tried to craft a strategy that leaned into a kind of not him, us message that said, the power of change in this country doesn't come from the top down. It's really people banding together that has made this country great. We've seen that in the labor movement, in the civil rights movement. And so we tried to use that both in our internal conversations around why we're supporting Biden, in addition to our local candidates and our plan to move into pressuring Biden after the election, and then also in our engagement with voters. And the other thing that we've found really important, especially in kind of rural communities, but I think other communities as well, is it helps to de-emphasize political parties and to be honest with voters, to say, here's what I'm wrestling with in our deep canvassing conversation. So we don't lead with, we want you to vote for the Democrat, like the art of deep canvassing, which was very important for our strategy was to really engage around a values-based conversation. What's happening to your family? What do you want to see happen in this country? And then be honest and position ourselves with, why voting for Biden is part of making the change we want to see in our communities. So let's see, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I think I have a few more minutes, but so another thing that we were really focused on, I've never been part of a program that reached this kind of scale before. We had almost 9,000 unique volunteers, and we had 400,000 conversations with voters, with PA Stands Up, and then kind of some of our national partners. And you really got to set up for that. You have to start training people early and have a really firm ladder of engagement and leadership development to be able to have a program that can absorb that many volunteers. So we had a fellowship program. It was like 10 sessions to train people how to have conversations, persuasive conversations, to teach them how to do a one-on-one, to teach them how to do all these organizing fundamentals. And that program wrapped up, I think, in May, so that we could, have 70 leaders who are really trained on some of those basics, who could be the backbone both of our 9 local chapters and also of the electoral efforts. And I was on the communications side, and I built a kind of parallel program in communications called the Narrative Squad, which worked with volunteers from our local chapters, had 10 sessions to train them on things like, how do you manage social media feed? How do you do an op-ed to your local paper? And really think about how we could reach scale in terms of shaping the conversation as well. And I think those leadership development programs are really what's gonna, what sets us up for success, not just in the election cycle, but in building our base and building local organizations that are going to last, and leaders who are going to go on and take other roles in the movement. Or some of those people went on to become campaign managers, communications directors for candidates. And in rural areas, that matters a lot because there's not a lot of those folks who have that training. One of our local candidates ended up hiring a campaign manager from Iowa because she lives in a rural part of the state, and he was the guy who knew most about how to help her. And we want her to hire, one of our leaders next year. And then, 2 more quick things. So having local champions really helped. A lot of our local champions did not win in rural areas. And I think we have a lot more work to do. It's really tough if you're running in a district where there's 6 registered Republicans to every 4 registered Democrats to win, even on a really progressive populist platform. But those champions energize a base of people who are passionate. They are directly connected to that base. They can help build organizations. And so I think having those champions is really important. I think we might, as a result of 2020, think in some districts about moving down to school boards, to other local races that are a little bit more tangible, as we're building back up to some state-led races in certain places. I think those are the key learnings I have.
Great, thank you so much, Jacob. And just under time. Really loved the thinking around an investment in deep canvassing and thinking around flashpoint fights and upsurges as ways to catalyze, build long-term power. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and got a lot of good questions and comments popping up in the chat. So next we're going to welcome Rafael to talk a little bit about his work.
Thank you, Elvis, and great to be on here with you, Jacob, and Linda. So I was tasked with writing a chapter on the Latinx vote in 2020, specifically what happened. And I specifically wanted to respond to there was a lot of chatter around the rightward trend of Latinos moving for Trump more so than 2016. And, absent of most of the pundits who would speak on it, I felt completely did not acknowledge some of the core undercurrents that was driving that movement, and also wanted to lift up really what actually did work, what moved our people not only to vote, but also reject fascist Trump politics. I won't say for Biden particularly, because I think folks just kind of voted for the a rejection of Trump. The first thing I'd want to note is that there was a huge increase. It was a 30% increase in the Latino vote from 2016 to 2020, which is significant. I think most of this credit goes to the organizations on the ground that I want to speak to. In huge Latino states, there was a 3-to-1 margin against Trump. And in huge counties within, some of Texas, Florida, except for Miami-Dade, there was a 2-to-1 margin. And, Latinos played a significant role, as Linda mentioned, in helping to defeat Trump, both in Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. My focus really to try to tell this story about the vote. Obviously, I couldn't cover the vote everywhere, but I really wanted to talk about both Georgia, work in Georgia that has been referenced, Arizona, and then also just Latinos in relationship to Bernie in particular. My main point really was, and I think for most folks on this call who do this work, it's not going to be brand new stuff, but I think it's important stating is that in places where we had year-round organizing, so not just dropping into the election, but year-round base building organizing that is actually helping to make meaning from our communities of all the conditions, so the economic, social, political injustice that is happening. And then that work pivots into electoral works, where you had that as 1, 2, national support, both in infrastructure, technical capacity, resources, and 3, an expansion of voter accessibility or making it easier for our folks to vote. That's where you really saw massive gains when you have all 3. And that was a recipe for our growth. And yet, as noted, there was some gains that Trump made with Latino Vote. And I want to speak directly to that. And I think of points that were really not acknowledged and kind of ignored by most folks when they speak about the Latino Vote. I think you have to start with the 2008 crisis, and essentially that being a huge moment, demarcation, not only for Latinos, I think broadly for the working class, but Latinos in particular. You had the largest transfer of wealth from working class folks, Black and brown folks, to the 1% in this country. And instead of using state power to curtail or lessen the effects, right, you had individuals were held responsible while corporations were actually given a bailout. And I think that's a significant thing that's still playing itself out. When you look at the moment of the response, for example, FDR, generations of working class people have an association with the Democratic Party when you saw the expansion of benefits protections for working people in the US. And in 2008, the response was not the opposite or insufficient. Now, to be clear, FDR does this in the moment where the US is ascending as the center of economic power in the world. Obviously, President Obama is taking over at the ongoing collapse of the US dominance. And so there's less room to play with, not to mention we don't have the same organizing capacity to force and push those demands. And so you go from this 2008 crisis to the pandemic, where especially Latinos were sacrificed at the altar of profit. Latinos were dying at the highest rates. And you see a lack of, you're an essential worker, but yeah, go make us that money. And there's very little protection, very little ability. And I think those things really are still going to play out for years to come within our community in a significant way. And leads me to this, Latinos are, we have many identities, many different countries of origin or where we come from, Dominicano, Boricua, Mexicano. And so Afro-Latino, indigenous, mestizo, etc. But one thing that is pretty much overwhelmingly unifying is a working class identity across Latinos in the US. And so this is a significant, I think has a significant role, especially when mentioning the previous points. On top of that, if you look at Latinos, we do not have the same allegiance to the Democratic Party that's seen within the Black community. We don't have, Black people in the US generally vote over 90% for the Democratic Party. We rarely break 70. In 2020, we got to 63%, right? And we don't have the stalwarts, we don't have the leaders that really were forged within struggle and are part of the Democratic Party. And I will note here separately that you're starting to see some of this be chipped away even within the Black community when you have leaders like John Lewis, those who are part of that building power pass on, and you're seeing inroads being made. But, just to say we don't even have that to kind of withstand sort of the attacks from the right or the appeals from the right to our communities. And then on top of that, you have the reality that neither party is resolving our core issues. And when I talk about the 2008 crisis, that happens when you have a 40-year decline in essentially benefits and pay for working class people in the U.S. And that income inequality is greater, at the time that Obama takes his presidency than it was during the Great Depression. And so all of these are factors, and you have a political system that is unable to respond to these crises. And all of these really, to me, explain why Trump, but also why Bernie. And it's less about, necessarily there is a core of Latinos who are very much have an appeal to right-wing authoritarianism, but it's also, I think, what we're seeing is people are looking for somebody who's pointing to some villains, right? Trump pointed to the swamp or the political elite class. Bernie spoke to the capital or corporate power behind that, and also had a much more unifying racial justice, pro-LGBTQ lens that was broad and that was focused on the environment. Well, obviously Trump is, sort of lifting up white supremacy in his own power. But I strongly in the book, I was basically framing that this all of these conditions is really can explain why people are looking for solutions that are not being resolved within either party. And it also offers us an opportunity as organizers to actually provide it, since the traditional party system is collapsing, or especially within Latinos has less relevancy, and folks are looking for those solutions. So speaking briefly to Georgia, Arizona, and then Bernie campaign, in Arizona, in the midst of what seems like a lot of loss and that we're not making victories, I think it's a good moment to step back and lift that as a great example of actual victories that we've been able to build. Again, specifically, our own community's capacity to organize, which is one of the central points in the chapter, is that, after 2010, there's the 1070 law, Sensenbrenner bill. Two organizations that I mentioned, Lucha and Puente, start to organize to defend our communities against the attacks of racial profiling and increased deportations. And that work soon after led not only to the recall of Sensenbrenner, we kick out our PIO. And then 2020 ends up where you have two Democratic senators for the state that was the last to recognize MLK's birthday. I mean, Public Enemy made a song about him. And now we have essentially two Democratic senators. Now, we know who those senators are, but it is a movement. It is a movement that is in our direction. And it was a recipe that was both the self-organizing capacity on the ground. There was a lot of national support. I can speak as when I was the political director that we were resourcing along with many other national orgs, and the voter expansion laws. And I want to really lift this up, that they were so successful that in 2016, before you could collect ballots and take them to the elections office, after 2016, they made that a felony. So that's how much of a threat that part of the election process was to right-wing power in the state. Georgia, something similar, where you have Adelina Nichols, which Linda mentioned earlier. She's been organizing for 20 years within GLAR, and GLAR had never done electoral politics. And in 2018, GLAR and Adelina, like myself, are founding members of GLAR, being a founding organization of Mi Gente. And in 2018, we decided to enter into electoral politics in that state, and particularly in support of the Abrams candidacy. We saw that as an important moment to represent Latino support for a Black candidate in the South. And it had significant impacts on the Latino vote. We were able to massively increase the Latino vote, and it was a good testing ground for 2020. I'll just mention that, in 2020, one of the things that the electoral focus has always been is not only was there inroads on obviously the presidential and the Senate, but there was two sheriff races where GLAR was able to take out essentially two sheriffs who were participating in the 287G program that facilitates the deportation of our people. And so focused on those two counties, really driving the electoral work on Before we used to just, GLAR used to do deportation work. Now that helps when we were, both of those elections were won. And now you don't have the same pressure and the same cooperation between the sheriffs and the federal government. Therefore, having some release and a little bit of respite for our community in those counties. And now we're looking to see where else you can do that in Georgia to move those platform and demands forward. Also to note, in Georgia, they also have the third thing, which is facilitating voting. They restricted, obviously, and folks have seen this. So they've started to restrict the voting and make it more difficult. The last piece that I want to mention is just the Bernie, in the Bernie and the Latinos' relationship to Bernie. In Texas, a lot of folks mention about Rio Grande and how Trump won on the margin, started to get inroads there. Trump won margins, Bernie won majorities in the Rio Grande Valley. So in the same region where you saw Trump make gains, Bernie won outright all of those counties in the Rio Grande, won the majority for the Democratic nominate primary. Not only that, had the campaign, and I was the state director for California, and obviously no state director wants to give up resources, but I can tell you now, we would have, I think it would have been a good decision to have actually given some of our resources, because if they would have had half of what we had, we would have won Texas easily. We would have run up the score, particularly in Latino communities that were looking for somebody to speak to the conditions over 40 years of loss of economic benefits, the lack of infrastructure in our community. And so there, we could have actually won. And so it's significant that when folks want to say that Trump made inroads, what folks are looking for is solutions. Unfortunately, some of those actually are appealing to some of our people. I think I'm 2 minutes out. So the last thing I'd say is, within California in particular, one of the things we did with the Bernie campaign there, where we did run up the score with the Latino Vote, and massively, and is that we maximized the opportunity to facilitate voting, especially for low propensity voters, right? Folks who are not as engaged. And so there you actually still can get a ballot and deliver it to the elections office. Now there is a law that they did to try to restrict it where you have to have chain of custody, but you could still do it. You just have to do it. And we did it with volunteers. We actually had a massive volunteer operation. They would collect ballots at the door, hand them over to our actual staff. There was an actual form. We did all of this in every single office across the state, and we would turn those in every single day. And that was a significant reason why we were able to really increase the Latino vote in support of Bernie, again, for a community that was already receptive to that type of politics. The last piece that I'll say is the challenges that I feel that I lift up that I think are core to our issues is, one, as Latinx people, as Latinos in the US, we have a diversity that I mentioned of where we come from, the languages we speak, et cetera. And so it is critical that we start to forge both much more building local capacity and connect our fights nationally. So we start to create an identity within this country that is unified and that is clearly aligned with the progressive left politics that the Democratic Party is not going to do for us, and we have to do for ourselves. I also mentioned, the corporate media, especially like the Univisions, are atrocious and constantly putting out right-wing, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ ideas, and that's the air we breathe in when we're organizing. And so I just wanted to name how damaging that is as a force within our communities. And then also, a lot of the Latino operatives who are in politics that are associated, whether the Democratic Party or not, sometimes are gatekeepers, or are many times were the biggest obstacle, for example, even within the Bernie campaign, to push that politics. And so just naming that is sometimes a challenge that we have to be aware of and confront. And that, again, makes us build our power within our communities, and that is from where we could push our politics. Hope I didn't go too much over.
Oh, thank you, Rafael. Just fascinating analysis. Really love that you contextualized the shift in Arizona. And there's so much there with regards to the Latinx community that I'm hoping we revisit with some of the respondents. So speaking of which, we wanted to turn to Rand Wilson, longtime labor organizer, as our first respondent. Rand, you've got the floor.
Hey, thank you, Elvis, and thank you, Rafael, Linda, Jacob. Really, really interesting insights. most of which, coming from the perspective of Massachusetts, don't apply here. We are this unbelievably liberal, solid blue state. In anticipation of 2022, we need to go to Maine, we need to go to Pennsylvania, we need to go elsewhere to win elections, because that's not the struggle here in Massachusetts. Just a couple of things. I want to give a shout out to the Our Revolution Massachusetts folks that are on this Zoom tonight. Our co-chairs, Henry Wardis and Martha Kacheri, and stalwarts like Michael Gilbreth, Russell Friedman, Robin Bergman, who have been part of a significant effort in this state to change the Democratic Party. And we have a Democratic Party that has abandoned the working class. We have a Democratic Party that supports, income and wealth relief for the wealthiest citizens of the state. Just passed a tax relief for the estate tax on the most wealthy people here. Outrageous. When it came to tax cuts, tax rebates, because we're flush with money and there's a movement for tax rebates. They want to exclude those citizens who make less than $38,000 a year because they already got some COVID money relief. So this is the kind of liberal politics that we're facing here in Massachusetts that really needs to be called out and opposed. And I'm very proud to be part of the Our Revolution group, which is built on local chapters like the one I'm part of, Our Revolution Somerville. All of our strength in the labor movement, our strength comes from the local work that we do on a shop by shop, employer by employer, contract by contract basis. And the same applies to electoral politics. Want to give another shout out to Larry Cohen, the chairperson of Our Revolution nationally, who had a chapter in Power Concedes Nothing book, and has done the kind of yeoman work within the National Democratic Party that we want to emulate here in Massachusetts. And so I'll just say that this sort of dichotomy between the corporate Democrats and the emerging progressive politics in this country that's been well articulated in the book. We're seeing that in Massachusetts with the state party really abandoning the working class and especially allowing the growth in Massachusetts of Trumpism. I won't say pro-Trump, but Trumpist kind of thinking in the central part of the state, southeastern part of the state, and they don't want to address it. And this is a huge tactical and strategic error to allow the growth of these parts of the state without being addressed. Whoop, I'm getting a high sign that it's time to shut up. I'll just say in conclusion, let's work together for those of you in Massachusetts to address the failures of our Democratic Party and its lack of democracy. I'm going to post in the chat a link to the Democratic Party Reform Group, and that we're trying to pull together here to continue to make changes and confront corporate Dems in Massachusetts. Thank you very much, Elvis, for the heads up. And I'll turn it over to you for the next respondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Rand. Always appreciate your insight, and also thank you for stirring the pot. I think we got some good some comments in the chat, and I think some thinking that hopefully lead to a really good discussion, question and answer period after the respondents. So thanks again. I'm going to turn it over now to Beth Wong, Executive Director of the Mass Voter Table, to respond to the panelists.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I really loved this validating and motivating book. I actually was just reading it last week, and I really appreciate the time that organizers took to reflect on their experiences from probably the most intense year of many of our lives, and share their lessons with all of us. And so, in my everyday work, I lead the Massachusetts Voter Table. Our mission is to expand the electorate in Massachusetts. I particularly loved the reframing of low propensity voters, which sounds technical, puts people in a box. It's like they have this low propensity to do things, into low investment, high potential voters. When our trusted leaders at our community organization coalition members contacted their neighbors in 2020 through some door knocking, mostly phone banking and texting, we saw a 6 percentage point increase in voter participation in our, I'll say, low investment target universe. These are people who will never get a mailer from the Democratic Party. They won't even get a text message, right? And so when we saw that, we saw the 6 percentage point increase, and we did that on $10 per voter contact. Versus what I've seen quoted is $25 per voter contact by big dollar consulting firms that run those canvas teams that pay people like $12 an hour or whatever is the minimum wage. But of course, that $10 per contact doesn't reflect the full cost of year-round organizing that happens 52 weeks of the year, every day, that base building, that issue campaigning on issues that people really care about. And I really resonated with what you said, Jacob, about your work in Pennsylvania. We really need to work together at the state level. We need to go far beyond the local level. We will hit the limit very fast of what is possible in progressive cities like Boston and Somerville. All of the important action on rising rents, resources for public schools, investment in transportation systems, all of that happens at the state level. And so when we take a look at the state legislature, we see that 97 of the seats are credibly urban in some way, where there are a lot of people of color, a lot of immigrants, people rely on public transit, people live in dense housing. Those are 97 gettable districts, but only 16 of them are in the city of Boston. Only 3 of them are in the city of Cambridge. Only 3 of them are in the city of Somerville. So we clearly have a lot to expand on beyond where we currently do most of our political work. And the last piece that I think is really interesting that I've heard woven throughout the panels today, and also in this wonderfully inspiring and motivating book that I hope that people buy and read, is that governing power really relies on our leadership pipelines. We want leaders to become candidates. We want organizers to become chiefs of staff. We want membership bases to turn into voting blocks and then constituents. And that means that our organizations need to be strong enough with these deep ranks of leadership. And right now, that I think that is the piece that is badly missing, right? It is really hard for many of us to have organizers who stick around for 2 years in order to become lead organizers who then can run campaigns. And so I really feel that this investment in the long game of the 3 to 5 years of base building in order to make a C4 strategy, a progressive challenger, viable. That is the missing piece, and it sounds really simple to say out loud. It is really hard to do in real life. It takes the everyday commitment, the everyday work, year round, midterm year, presidential year, local year, doesn't matter. And so this work of expanding the electorate is going to take a lot of hard work, particularly outside of Greater Boston, and I hope to do that work with all of you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for providing the excellent perspective, and really resonated the importance of leadership development and retention. I mean, I think it's, as was noted, it's a problem we're all facing, and I always appreciate the more expansive geographic look, so thank you so much. Turning it over now to Vanessa Snow from Mass Vote to close this out, respondents.
All right, thank you. All right, so great things I've heard. Many of what the panelists shared definitely resonate with me. I've organized with community-based organizations, I've organized with unions, and now I'm currently at Mass Vote, which is a 501c3 organization. One, I think, challenge that I don't think is unique to Massachusetts, but it definitely is a challenge, is the nonprofit industrial complex. And I'm saying that as someone who works in a nonprofit 501c3 organization, which definitely could use more resources to do electoral work. But Massachusetts has one of the highest amounts of nonprofit organizations in the state, in the country. What I have noticed, and I think it was something that has been mentioned, we have these amazing grassroots organizations that do issue-based work. And when it comes to entering the electoral space in a clear and principled, and even, I guess, I don't know if it's partisan, but when there is a clear candidate, our leaders feel limited by the status of the organizations that they may work in or they may lead. And so I think what comes out of that is we have many of our community leaders who feel as though they can't take a public position when it comes to engaging in electoral fights, unless it's a ballot campaign, for example. And even then we see some hesitation there. But one time I heard an elder who was an organizer in the Puerto Rican independence movement with the Young Lords say, your 501c3 job is not the movement. And that's something that I've taken really seriously, and that, I have to be organizing all the time, whether I'm getting paid or not. But for that example, working in a nonprofit organization and feeling as though you have to stay neutral, I think many of our leaders end up being absent from the conversation around who should be running to represent our communities, as well as even learning the experience, having the experience on how to run a campaign, how to become an operative on a campaign. We have a very small pool of especially BIPOC staff that are qualified to staff that campaign or know how to do it. And if they're working in an organization that's abstaining from that electoral process, then where is it that they're going to learn that space? I think like a lot of that, as a Latina, I'm saying that this is something that I've noticed in Latino leadership in Massachusetts. I also think that we have different challenges in terms of engaging Latinos in as we would on the West Coast, Southwest, in that we have a more new population that does not have that much context about Latinos in social movement in the United States. We also have people who are more recent immigrants who may have recently left due to leftist or right-wing politics. And when they come to the United States, they just feel very apprehensive about engaging in our elections due to that trauma. And I know I should wrap up a little bit, but yeah, I think we need to figure out how to mesh issue-based organizing and community organizing with the electoral process, because we're not trying to elect our saviors. We're trying to elect our targets, which means that we're trying to set the conditions in which we're organizing in. We're trying to set the rules. And so, I think that's something important for us as movement folks to think about when engaging in electoral politics. We're not, there's a way to do it in a principled and aligned way that doesn't involve selling out. And so, I mean, one question that I think I would have for any of the panelists is the idea of, you know, there's so many different ways to engage in a campaign, whether it's through, you know, independent and uncoordinated campaigns, or directly engage, involving ourselves in running our own candidates and working to build strong campaigns for our own candidates. And so I'm just interested in perhaps hearing more about folks' experiences in working in either or both of those spaces.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Really interesting. And you've got some appreciation already on the chat, and some interesting questions populating from what you just shared with us. Before we go into the questions, just if, you know, I know we're mostly on mute, but if we can show our appreciation to the panelists and respondents, emojis, drop something in the chat. I see Charles has already got us going, but just a really wonderful, you know, panel presentations and respondents, and I think making for a really rich conversation. So I will use the sort of moderator's prerogative and start with actually the penultimate question. There are several questions, and feel free to please add more in the chat that Henry provided. Henry, you can read it off yourself, or it will be spotlighted, or we can read it off for you, but it dovetails nicely with what Vanessa was just you know, sharing with us, and questions that were raised earlier by Beth around retention and infrastructure, you know, the sort of staff intensive work, super volunteers, that leadership development pipeline, and how do we sustain and fund it, and also connects back to an earlier question Henry posed around funding for all of this. So there seems to be a really kind of critical question around our actual capacity to do this, funding, the model, if it's a staff-centric. You know, some of us say, you know, the movement will not be staffed. Well, then what's the model? How does that look like? And what's your experience in each of your localities? So I'll turn it over to the panelists and or the respondents if you care to take the first step.
I'll just say very briefly, yeah, it takes resources. It takes real resources to do the work. And oftentimes I just want to resonate with something I think Vanessa was saying, that the nonprofit world sometimes, because of the way the nonprofit world kind of fragments, not to mention its legal structure, it makes it more difficult for folks who are kind of doing their social justice organizing within a nonprofit frame. There's some real difficulties there, but they're not, they're difficulties that can in fact be overcome. So I think it'd be useful. I think this is one of the places where the book is useful. So I'm just going to use the domestic workers as an example. You know, the National Domestic Workers Alliance did not engage in, you know, candidate endorsement or anything like that, was not legally, could not do that, but decided that it was important because the domestic worker work involves, you know, baseline organizing, political education, you know, working with people around wage theft and working conditions, and doing policy work in state legislatures, that it was that the character of those state legislatures and also the character of the people who were in Congress mattered. And so a decision was made several years ago to set up something called Care in Action, which is a C4. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong about all this. They set up a C4 and a PAC in order to, and it, you know, so it takes resources, it takes fundraising skills, it takes a different kind of political work, which is then within the context of this Care in Action, a lot of calls about which candidate, why, where are the women of color candidates? Do they support a care agenda? Will they be accountable in any way? if we get them in the state legislature? What are we trying to do in the state legislature? Are we trying to move a Bill of Rights thing? So, which is to say that their political, logistical, and financial considerations for all of this, for anybody who's trying to figure out how to link their ongoing organizing work to electoral work, it's a lift, but it's not an impossible lift. And folks have done it, and they have and they've shared their lessons in the book to say, you know, in part, what does this take? And I would also say that one of the benefits of this is that it, you know, if you're kind of a membership-based organization, it gives members a different vantage point. I'm not talking about staff now. I'm talking about, you know, members of a grassroots organization. It gives members then a different kind of political education about, you know, what is the political context we're organizing in. And it develops yet another set of skills in which organizers can learn and excel. So it's just to say that recognizing the difficulties and also understanding that there are people who have overcome those difficulties and are prepared to share those lessons.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda. Before we toss that question to the other panelists, there's a quick question in the chat, which is just if you could say a word or two clarifying what is CARE in action?
So sorry, CARE in action is the C4. It's develops candidate. It looks for and supports particularly women of color candidates who are prepared to move a CARE agenda, i.e. an agenda that speaks both to those who need care, children, elders, people with disabilities, and those who constitute the care workforce. And so, which is why it's called CARE in Action. It takes that agenda into the electoral arena. Have I been clear?
Crystal. Thank you, Linda. Turn it over to Rafael.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I agree with everything that Linda just stated. And, you know, within Mi Gente, one of the frameworks that we've adopted from our comrades in the South in Chile, who were actually part of the left front that elected Boric, they basically have a framework where you build outside of the state, against the state, and within the state. And, you know, Adelina Lickles and GLAR is a very powerful example. She was the only, with maybe one or two other staff for 20 years approximately. And most of the work was done outside of the state. So they had popular assemblies across the state. She'd been building mass kind of participation against the state, defending our community against deportation. And it wasn't only until their 18th, 20th year that they went into the foray of electoral works in 2018. And because they had done all of that work, they had already people who were like solid members who had been in the struggle, who transitioned into the electoral work. And to Linda's point, there was fundraising that was brought in from outside of state. Mi Gente as a national partner obviously brought some in, but that allowed them to scale up massively pretty quickly in something that is very new terrain, very new work, very foreign to the organization, and have a significant impact on the electoral work. That being said, GLAR and I think Mi Gente in general, we do not look at that within the state as, we look at that as, again, one of the three terrains that we struggle in. And really the base is what we always have to prioritize and really resource and develop and expand on. So whether the candidate, you know, I don't think we're at GLAR is at a level in few places where within Mi Gente at a level where we're moving a ton of our own members to run. That being said, we are still moving platform issues and therefore holding candidates accountable and getting victories like getting rid of 287G, for example, in those two counties, which is a huge victory for our community. So I would say that a lot of the work to that question was done, you know, not in the electoral. You had a base that was there, and then it could easily pivot to that work.
Thank you, Rafael. That Chilean said outside multi-terrain tragedy reminds me of that Allende quote. We didn't choose the terrain, we received it. We have the government, but not the power. Yeah, just the way to kind of crystallize what we're facing. I think Beth and then Jacob.
I have a few comments on the resourcing piece. And what I really loved, I've told you all to buy and read the book. I'm going to do that again. I actually really love Deepak's chapter at the end. And he says that we consistently need to raise tens or hundreds of millions of independent dollars per year for every election. I don't think that we actually need to do exactly that in Massachusetts. But we do need to be very serious about raising money. The revolution won't be staffed, but we absolutely do still need staff organizers to be able to stay in their jobs, pay their rising rent, and see it as not a thing that they do before graduate school, which is totally how many of our organizations treat young organizers. And so one piece that in addition to the long-term investment in organizing that I think we need to get very serious about pursuing every C3 dollar, every C4 dollar, and every PAC dollar for, local elections are actually pretty cheap. Only 10,000 people voted in the Springfield mayoral election. And when we even think about $25 per vote on the high end from a high-end consulting or a high-end canvas firm, that's actually not that much money that we need to raise. And so when we can actually double turnout and win a potential majority in cities as large as Springfield, a city of like 200,000 people with a lot of Latinx and Black residents, like it's actually not that expensive. But we do need to get very serious about raising the money and spending it on organizing, not spending it on the feel good stuff, not spending it on the stuff that makes us feel like we're right, but spending it in ways that actually build our power. And then I think once we run these programs, we need to basically shout it from the rooftops that we won these elections and that these politicians need to fear us. So I think it's two steps. It's like, and again, all this stuff is easier said than done, but like, we need to get very serious about raising the money. We need to focus it on some local elections, like the Springfield mayor probably controls five state reps. And then we need to really consistently win the win and be feared by these elected officials.
Thank you, Beth. Jacob?
Gosh, there's like so many threads now that I want to connect to, but I guess I want to go all the way back to Rand and say something that kind of runs through a number of these things, which is I started organizing when I moved to Chicago in Illinois. So I have a sense of like a different terrain of struggle at the state level. And it's just so different to be in a swing state. I mean, for like participating in this election, it's like the question is how to channel the fire hose of money and volunteers and like take that and move it strategically. And there's just a lot of money in electoral politics too, money that's not out there in issue politics, but it's sometimes harder to find. So when I think about the just absolutely insane amounts of advertising money that's just spent to disappear, it's just like, how do we get more of that going to our organizations and building our leadership? And then kind of going back to Rand and also Raphael's kind of inside, outside, different terrains of struggle. One of the things that started with Reclaim before I was involved, long before I was involved, was award strategy. And I think thinking about the Democratic Party as a terrain of struggle, the way in which the party has been hollowed out in certain places, especially in rural areas where like party seats are unoccupied, there's real chances to take over the party and run the machine. And that's a different situation than I mean, it's possible in big cities too, and Reclaim has made a lot of inroads in Philadelphia, but I think thinking about, how do we put our people inside of the party as well as inside of the state is like interesting, and it creates different dynamics too. I think we're so used to being like on the outside, like, holding people to the fire. And then when we like put someone in the state house, we have to figure out a different relationship with those people a different kind of accountability, and or when there's stuff happening at a committee meeting, how are we strategizing with our folks who are in the hot seat once they're there, so that we're holding them accountable and like strategizing with them seems important.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Definitely another plug for the book, the Ryan Greenwood chapter, Movement Politics, and as you know, a lot of the People's Action work on movement governance. I think that's the this piece. Wanted to actually share two questions. One, which I think you already covered, Jacob, around the fundraising and funding base, which you spoke about the influx of resources coming in around election time. But our very first question of the night was around what was the impetus to actually bring the groups in PA Stand Up together?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the part of the impetus was like, we need statewide power, like, and we're going to have to.
Hello.
We're going to have. We need statewide power, and we're reaching the kind of limits of our local power. And also, a number of the groups were just doing kind of lobbying issue-based work, especially out of the groups that had kind of started in the resistance, were in resistance mode, like, let's call Congress, let's do a demonstration in our town. And they were ready after 2-3 years of doing that to say, actually, we need to be electing our people at the local level. And we need to be serious players in statewide politics. We can't just call people, like, we need to be the people. And so I think that was a big part of the impetus. Although on the staffing question, I'll also say a lot of these chapters are volunteer run. A lot of them still have active volunteer involvement. Like, I mean, definitely they have a volunteer team, but you need some staff to help make that sustainable. Otherwise, you're going to have volunteers burning out. So.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Two, I think, interesting comments coming through in the chat around the sort of particulars around Massachusetts context in politics with the neoliberal Democrats in the driver's seat, and part of that also being the challenges that are faced with the scheduling. Not sure if either, Rand, you spoke earlier to the really kind of pushing out of a working class or marginalizing of a working class agenda through the Democratic Party, and Beth, you've been, very connected to a lot of the work pressuring our Secretary of State, to move in ways that make the election process much more accessible, and not just for folks voting, but for prospective candidates. So, curious if either of you want to, in the short amount of time that we have, just field a reflection or response to those comments. Was that a hand, Rand?
Go Sox. No, I really don't have anything to add. Beth, what about you?
I'm sometimes just shocked about how weak the Democratic Party is in Massachusetts. I was like one of like 50 interns at the Democratic Party of Wisconsin in the summer of 2010 in their Madison office. Like, that does not exist here. And so I think that opens up lots of opportunities for us to struggle on the terrain of the Democratic Party, but also outside of the Democratic Party in both ways. Like, it's like 2 staff people. It's so incredibly weak here that we actually have a huge amount of we of course need to still get serious about our actual organizing outside the Democratic Party also. But it was actually shocking how easy it was to become a MassDems delegate in my ward. And the infrastructure is so weak, and the problem is it's very dispersed. It's like a super many-headed hydra. And so because it's so dispersed, but still also so weak, that's why the kind of community mapping across the state is so important in our regular organizing.
Yeah, I would just add that the party is essentially, marginalized and weak because our supermajority of Democratic elected officials don't want to be held accountable to anybody or any entity, and they're not interested in having a political party in this state. And so that's the reason that our party is such a kind of limp, and vague party that it's just needed for to run the primaries, and then when it does it unfairly. So I won't go into it.
Got Linda and Rafael, if you want to take a minute each, and then we'll do a closing announcement and a little quick appreciation.
Yeah, just to say a couple of things. One, if your Democratic Party is weak, then you've got a great experiment to run, which is, what happens when progressives take over the Democratic Party and what can and can't they do? I mean, that's an experiment we need. Everybody needs to learn from that. I think it's true in many states, in many cities, that is the case. If you know that, then run that experiment and let us know where you are 5 years down the road. In terms of running a truly progressive, working class oriented Democratic Party. We need that as an experiment. Yeah, the other piece is I'm going to just guess that you've got a few conservative voters. I've seen Confederate flags in Massachusetts, my own self, more than one. I've seen really reactionary bumper stickers in your state, more than one. So there's also, you've got lessons to teach us on organizing white working class voters, let's just say, possibly. All the reactionary white working class voters are not sitting in North Carolina and Georgia. There's a whole bunch of them in Massachusetts. So if somebody starts to do that door knocking, we've got lessons to learn from you. And then the last thing I'll say is read the Seed the Vote chapter. So if you all have an excess, especially in national elections, if you all have an excess of capacity and all kinds of people who want to do stuff and your state is safe, then people need you to organize folks to be texting and phoning and going to other states. And Seed the Chapter has created a great model for that.
Thank you so much. Rafael?
Just co-sign everything Linda said, and I just would add that California has a lot of similarities with Massachusetts, and the distinction being it has a much stronger Democratic Party, and it's been able to thwart actually progressive in trying to take over. But with that said, it's moved it to in that direction, and so there has been some victories. We've had some significant incumbents taken out that folks did not expect happen from the city council level to state races. So, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to hone in the ability to build up infrastructure that both transforms the state in the ways that Linda mentioned, but also then you have a much more bigger resources when the presidentials, et cetera, come that you all can push out because you have a much more trained group of people that can do that work.
Excellent. I think the last couple of questions and comments have, I think, really triggered a really interesting conversation and discussion, and a lot of it taking place in the chat. So just want to plug the August 11th meeting that will happen, take place as a kind of a continuing on of this conversation. So folks who want to continue this really rich conversation, please RSVP there. And for those of you who can't come off mute, if we could just give a round of applause and appreciation for just the fantastic panelists that we had today. I think everyone shared such amazing insights and real lessons to take forward with us. So just a round of applause and a thank you for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been great being in conversation with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you for your work.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.